It was 2004 and the coaster wars were in full swing. Cedar Point opened top Thrill Dragster the previous year, and Hersheypark just unveiled their first hydraulic launch coaster with inversions. Intamin was leading the pack with their ultra-intense roller coasters, but there was another manufacturer standing off on the side but definitely not out of sight. Bolliger and Mabillard were doing their thing, building typical loopers and the occasional hyper or flyer. Up to this point, the dive coaster was kept to a basic layout that featured one big drop, no inversions, and a short ride time. Well, B&M was ready to change that by introducing their first ever hyper dive coaster, SheiKra. With impressive stats for its time, SheiKra stands 200 feet, reaches a max speed of 70 miles per hour, and has 3,188 feet of track. This is about triple the amount of track per the previous models. It was also the first time a dive coaster featured an inversion, and starting off big with a giant 145-foot Immelman. This inversion was one of the tallest in the world at its time. As a young enthusiast, I was super psyched for SheiKra, more so than King Ka, which felt like a been there done that type with Top Thrill. So no, my focus for 2005 was all about the dive coaster. I made plans that May and headed down to Busch Gardens, Tampa. I was so excited to ride SheiKra for the first time. I probably rode the roller coaster a dozen times as the park wasn't that busy. Well, it took another 15 years for me to get back to Busch Gardens and revisit this once beloved roller coaster. Presentation. Located in the Stanleyville section of the park, SheiKra is a well-themed roller coaster that fully immerses the riders and those walking around the attraction. The strongest parts of the theming has to be the tunnel that the coaster dives into during the second drop and the splashdown effect that follows after. I love the splashdown, and I could stand around in that area for a bit watching SheiKra doing its thing. There is this restaurant located behind the turnaround before the splashdown called Zambia Smokehouse. You could actually sit right underneath the track and watch the coaster fly right above you as it dives down into the water. If you ask me, SheiKra is one of the prettiest coasters in the park. I love the color scheme of the red track and blue supports. It really pops against the green foliage in the area. The ride sign, queue area, station, surrounding foliage, and splashdown area all come together, earning SheiKra a perfect 10 score for presentation. Ride intensity. For those who are afraid of heights, SheiKra might be as terrifying as it gets. For me, I might be afraid of heights on occasion, but dive coasters never really bothered me. Being strapped in, looking 200 feet straight down to the ground only gets me pumped up for the ride ahead. After climbing to the top of the lift, SheiKra takes a slow 180-degree turn to the right, providing its riders a panoramic view of Tampa Bay. The train then comes to a crawl as you inch over the 200-foot drop. After a brief pause, SheiKra takes a 90-degree plunge down to earth. The coaster immediately flies right back up into a giant Immelman. It's during this portion of the ride where riders will experience the strongest G-forces. I've been known to gray out a little at the bottom of this first drop. After completing the one and only inversion, SheiKra takes a 270-degree turn to the left, sending you up into the mid-course brake run. The second drop is just as fun as the first, providing a nice pop of airtime. This time you drop right into a tunnel that sends you out into a 180-degree turnaround. After the splashdown, the coaster finishes off with a helix that ends on the brake run. As I mentioned at the beginning of this segment, ride intensity can vary per person, but I think a solid 8 score seems reasonable. Fun factor. I think dive coasters have gotten a bad rap by the coaster community. Many consider them to be one-trick ponies, which, I mean they are, but the overall experience elevates the ride beyond a simple trick. Dive coasters tend to be one of the more popular attractions at any park that they reside in. SheiKra is no different, as I'd say it's the ride that pulls guests to the back of the park. B&M elevated the dive coaster by increasing its height, adding an inversion, and featuring a splashdown effect. However, there is one aspect of the ride that we haven't talked about, and that's the trains. Originally, this roller coaster featured the traditional trains that had floors. Well, after Griffin was announced, and going floorless, Busch Gardens Tampa decided that they wanted the same experience for their dive coaster. 2 years later, after opening, SheiKra was transformed into a floorless diving coaster. Now, this is the standard for all dive coasters. Now, I do have a small problem with this coaster, and that's the pacing. There are a few dull moments of the ride. The final helix is completely pointless and only pads the total ride time. The mid-course brake run brings the coaster to a grinding halt, but at the same time, this is needed so that the coaster can perform the second plunge at a reasonable speed. The slow portions of the ride, like the turnaround at the top of the lift, may lack the thrills, but it's also designed to hype up the rider as they crawl towards the edge of the first drop. In the end, I think a fun factor score of 9 is about on point. I can see some ranking this higher and others lower. Originality. B&M took their original dive coaster concept and mastered it with SheiKra. By increasing the height, adding an inversion, second drop, and splashdown, the dive coaster was improved on greatly. Now, the floorless trains may not have originated with SheiKra, but it was a positive change. SheiKra is also the first dive coaster to feature a true 90-degree plunge. Both Oblivion and G5, the previous models, only featured a drop of 87.5 degrees. This was to provide a more comfortable ride experience. Well, on SheiKra, the trains were updated with new spring-loaded upstops that allow the train to dive at a steeper angle. SheiKra earns a respectable 9 score for originality. Ride smoothness. After multiple rides spanning between 15 years, SheiKra is a butter-smooth ride that deserves nothing less than the perfect marks in this category. Unlike Valraven or Griffin, which both will get a little rattle occasionally, I felt nothing of the like on SheiKra. Now, I'm not saying that SheiKra can't get a rattle, but I didn't experience it, so I'm going to give it a 10 score for ride smoothness. Okay, the final score comes to 9.2, which is an excellent score. I haven't really beaten around the bush here with this review. I really like SheiKra. Of the 3 dive coasters that I've ridden, SheiKra is my favorite. The theming, layout, and airtime all come together to make one great coaster. My personal rating is going to be a 9.5. The only reason I take off a half a point is because of the pointless helix at the end of the ride. SheiKra is a fun roller coaster and is currently my favorite attraction at Busch Gardens, Tampa. I'm sure that this will change whenever Iron Gwazi gets its act together, but until then, SheiKra is the king at BGT. Well, that wraps up my review of SheiKra. What do you think of this dive coaster? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please click on the like button and subscribe. That way you continue to get great content brought to you by XscreamThrills.